Hello, Classics Drama Group. If you're watching this, it means I'm unable to make it in person or live to the session today, but I want to thank you for still allowing me to give this presentation on Aristophanes and Lysistrata. And I understand that everyone's read the play already, so rather than you know summarize the play or talk too much about the play itself, I just want in this presentation to fill in some of the background about the genre of Attic Old Comedy that Aristophanes was working in, and given a little historical and cultural context. I'll probably go over exceed the 10 minutes that I promised, and I guess all I can say is that feel free to watch the video on double speed. Okay, so introducing comedy, Aristophanes, and Lysistrata. So we first have to begin by talking about old comedy. Now, like tragedy, Greek comedy, as we know it, was part of the dramatic festivals of Athens. But more so than tragedy, comedy shows connections to rituals and rituals of impersonation and invective, that is, of like insult, mockery, what you could call satire, that are uh, run deep into Greek prehistory, into the archaic period and before, and throughout Greece. So even though the comedies that we have, the genre of dramatic comedy was just like tragedy, a product of Athens, a certain time and place, Athens in the 5th century. Um, its origins go back much farther. Just like tragedy, we know from Aristotle, or at least as Aristotle hypothesized, evolved out of the genre of dithrum, the choral songs in honor of Dionysus. Comedy seems to have more mysterious and possibly, multiple predecessors. We find black figure vases like this one that predate uh, uh, the comedies that we have with obviously dancers in animal costumes, like here are the birds, reminiscent of uh, Aristophanes' plays. In another one, we see a chorus of um, dancers dressed like horses next to an Alice player, um, much like we'd see in the theater. And we don't have a lot of firsthand evidence for uh, what exactly these songs or performances were like or what they meant. But we do know that they must have existed. Another kind of undercurrent, another predecessor of Greek comedy was the sympodic poetry, the kind of poetry read at drinking parties, and this included the very ribald and invective, as we say, that is obscene and uh, offensive, or not offensive, but insult poetry by the likes of Archilochus and Hipponax that definitely shares some of its um, tone with Aristophanes' comedy. Also, we should talk about the symposium, the drinking party. Not every symposium ended in intellectual conversation like Plato's dialogue of that name, in which, of course, Aristophanes himself is one of the participants. But often, these drinking parties would devolve into simply wild revelry. Here's a scene. No drinking party was complete without the flute girls, for whom music was not the only service they were expected to provide. Sometimes these drinking parties would, if they ran out of wine, they'd break out of the house that they were in and go roaming through the streets, singing obscene songs, looking for a party to crash or the next place to go. And this was called a comos, a revelry, wild party. And our word comedy, in fact, actually derives from this. The Greek word from which our word comedy comes, komoidia, is a compound from the word komos, meaning revel, and then ode, meaning song or singing. And so this is the evidence that we have that there's a long tradition of this kind of comic poetry in Greek culture. Aristotle actually gives us some of the few references to comedy that he makes in the Poetics, gives us an alternative derivation from a different dialect than Attic, where it comes from Kome, meaning village, and has to do with some kind of local ceremonies on the Peloponnese or even in, I think, Megara. Which goes to show that Athens wasn't though Athens is where dramatic comedy developed. It had much wider origins. In any case, tragedy as we know it did originate in Athens at the Athenian dramatic festivals, just like tragedy, and was performed at some of the same festivals. So you might recognize some of these next slides from I think from the presentation I did about Euripides. But the main dramatic festival in the Athenian calendar was the city Dionysia, and this was held in the center of Athens at the theater of Dionysus on the slope of the Acropolis. Or at least that's where the performances were held. And this was a spring harvest festival in March or April. And it would have been a week-long affair. This was one of the major festivals of the city that involved a lot of both religious and civic and military and other kinds of functions. But the main event was the tragic competition. For 3 days, tragedians would put on their trilogies. And then on the final day of the festival, the first, second, and third prize were handed out to them. But one thing I didn't mention in the first time we went over this is that comedies were present at the Dionysia as well. In fact, 5 comic playwrights presented 1 play each. I'm not sure if we know exactly how those were divided up among the days, but it seems like we get from references in Aristophanes himself, it sounds like the tragedies would the whole trilogies would be performed from the morning to the early afternoon, and then there'd be a break, and then the comedy would be performed in the evening. But comedy was the city of Dionysia. Tragedy was the prestigious event there. There's another festival, however, also dedicated to Dionysus, in which comedy was very much the main event, and that was a festival known as the Lanaya, because it took place at the altar of Dionysus Lanaion in the Athenian Agora, though eventually it was moved to the theater as well. This was a festival held in midwinter, so right around late January by our calendar. And it was a much smaller festival because, imagine in January wasn't the high tourist season for Athens there. There weren't the traveling, the visitors, the traveling dignitaries, the country relatives that would have swelled the city population in the springtime. But so it was a smaller and much more locally focused festival. It probably was the older of the two, though it seems that the dramatic competition at the Lanaya was added later than the Dionysia, after that one became so popular. But at the Linnaea, again, 5 comic playwrights competed for first, second, and third prize with 1 play each. And in at this festival, tragedy was the got second billing. There were 2 playwrights presenting 2 plays each, so it was a much less prestigious prize than the Dionysia. But nonetheless, it was an important festival for the Athenians, and this is where a lot of the Aristophanes plays were first performed. So when we talk about the performance of these plays, it's worth asking, what was old comedy like to have seen? And we should explain what I mean by old comedy, because we today divide ancient Greek comedy into roughly approximately 3 periods. By old comedy, we mean the plays produced in Athens in the 5th century, so during the the heyday of the democracy. And these plays, some characteristics that they were bawdy, satirical, often scatological. Playwrights mocked contemporary politics and social changes, and directly lampooned prominent citizens by name. So this is, where Lysistrata fits in. And Aristophanes is the only playwright from this period any of whose plays survive. We have many titles and names of playwrights and short fragments from others, but 11 plays of Aristophanes survive entire. And this is the closest I could find to a vase from Aristophanes' time depicting one such play. Here we have the Aulus player in the middle who would have accompanied the play, and then 2 dancers in bird costumes, and note the phallus on each. There's after the heyday of Aristophanes and his brand of comedy, he sort of actually at the end of his career slides into what scholars call middle comedy, as the nature of the plays underwent a kind of softening. They became less bawdy. They made fewer references to politics and to prominent individuals, and relied more on archetypal characters. And most importantly, the chorus becomes less and less important and essential to the stories of the plays. And this is the period when Athenian theater is becoming more and more, or less, I should say, Athenian, Athenocentric in character. Even though these plays, most of the theater at this time is still Athenian export, it's becoming popular all throughout Greece. More cities are building theaters, and these plays are being performed by local troops in other cities, as well as traveling productions. And the plays themselves are increasingly being written by and performed by non-Athenians. And so we get different brands of comedy. This vase is a style actually of the South Italian Fulax form of comedy, with these like very particular padded dancers in their satyr and Silenus costumes. But eventually, Greek comedy resolves into what we call new comedy at the end of the 4th century and all throughout the 3rd century. And so this is when plots essentially focus less on current events and more on domestic and family life, with stock characters, the clever slave and the foolish wealthy old man and things like that. So we've gone from this kind of freewheeling satirical burlesque to sitcoms, basically. And there's only one play from this period that survives substantially, and that's one that was actually recovered on papyrus, the Discolos, which translates to as like the grouch or the grumpy man, by Menander, who was without a doubt the most influential Greek comic playwright on Roman literature and subsequent ancient comedy. In fact, Menander's plots and characters were lifted basically wholesale and adapted by the early Roman playwrights Plautus and Terence. And you can see here an imperial era mosaic from Antioch showing Menander himself reclining with the personification of comedy next to him. And here's another mosaic from a Roman comic play that was probably based on Menander. So new comedy was when Greek comedy basically had its edges sanded off and became exportable in a big way. But let's go back and talk to what made old comedy old comedy. And it's really is something else. So here are just a few of the the unique characteristics of old comedy. It loved featuring animal choruses. Lysistrata, of course, doesn't have one, but if you just look at the titles of Aristophanes' other plays, you see the frogs, the birds, the wasps, which in this production have crustacean claws for some reason. And so we're really in a there are no rules in Aristophanes comedies. They really push stagecraft and dramatic imagination to the limit. Let's see. Another characteristic is, of course, I had something funny to say here, but I forgot it. So the phalluses abound. This plot isn't depicting an Aristophanes play in particular or a dramatic scene, but I think it gets the spirit of Aristophanes and especially the Lysistrata pretty well. So these plays are pretty obscene's not the right word, but they're very sexually explicit. Here's some clips from or some stills from recent productions of Lysistrata. Here's one, and here's the chorus of old men in another. Another thing that's pretty obvious reading the play is that a lot of it is, humor based around Athenian political and social subjects. Hyperlocal, and this is where translators often have the hardest time rendering Aristophanes into English. And if you compare several different translations of the Lysistrata, you'll see that there's you'll often find very wide variation into how these jokes and references and allusions are made. Some keep the obscure ancient references in, and others will try and update them with their modern day equivalents. But we all know, for example, that Aristophanes in The Clouds wrote the whole play mocking Socrates, whom he portrays as like an eccentric charlatan who's bilking his gullible students into paying enormous fees to be taught nonsense. And we'll talk more about the the particular figures that Aristophanes was fond of mocking. But when we get into the characteristics of the plays themselves, comedy is a lot more formally just like freewheeling and chaotic than tragedy was. In all the tragic plays that we've had, they follow they have variations, but they follow a pretty similar structure. They're scenes that advance the plot. That is the dialogue between the characters, which is all in iambic trimeter, alternating with the lyric passages sung by the chorus. So it alternates, scene of dialogue and then choral song, scene of dialogue, choral song. In tragedy, or in comedy, there's a few additional elements that are essential and that really give Aristophanes its flavor. So here's some parts of the play that help structure it. The parados, just like in tragedy, is the entrance song of the chorus that comes after the prologue. But in comedies, the chorus, as we've seen, is usually very flamboyant, and these entry songs are um, tend to be long and very elaborate, very structurally sophisticated, complicated, and they're kind of these show-stopping moments toward the beginning of the plays. The climax of the play comes in almost invariably, at least in the Aristophanes plays that we've had, in an agon. Agon, the word for contest or debate, and this is it's a climactic stylized confrontation between the protagonist and the antagonist. That's where they basically trade speeches that devolve into trading insults. It's very funny, but it's also very almost formal, the way it's organized. And then we get to the heart of the Aristophanes comedy that usually, but not always, comes after the agon, the parabasis. This literally means like the stepping, literally means like an aside. It means stepping aside. But this is the direct address, and this is the moment when the actors leave the stage, and it's just the chorus, and the chorus leader step up to the edge and address the audience directly, and just harangue them on whatever topic what the playwright has in mind, whatever he wants to get off his chest. He'll say here. There's several Aristophanes plays where he berates the audience for not giving his last play the respect it should have deserved and the prizes, and so there's almost like an interactive element here in the old Attic Greek comedy, where not only is the business of the city discussed, but then the citizens themselves are addressed by the playwright. You can see how these elements fit into the rest of the play here with kind of the breakdown of Lysistrata. The line numbers here are to the Greek because I don't know what translation everybody has. But Lysistrata is actually a really complicated play because the chorus is split into two. There's the men's chorus and the women's chorus. And so, really everything is doubled. All these patterns repeat, first with one chorus and then the other. But you can see that the parados happens, twice, and then we have iambic scenes where the dialogue among the actors alternate with first the agon and then the parabasis, and then there's a second agon actually when Lysistrata meets with the military ambassadors, and then finally the play ends with the exodus, that is the grand exit song for the chorus and all the actors. Okay, so let's dig into the Aristophanes himself and give a little context to this very topical playwright. He was born sometime after 460, which means that if you put his lifespan, this yellow bar, against a timeline of Athenian history, he was born two full generations after Aeschylus. He was much younger than Sophocles and Euripides. He was a child of the democracy. He was born in the radical Athenian democracy. That was his city. That was the city as he knew it. And so when you're reading Aristophanes and you get a lot of criticisms of democracy, you get a lot of criticisms of the the main figures in power, criticisms of especially in the Clouds when he has Socrates basically informing people how to trick people using ridiculous arguments. in the forum and things like that. He's never not a Democrat. He's never, for example, on the sides of the oligarchs or the the other enemies of Athens' way of um, government. But he's in fact a very passionate Democrat in some ways. Participate using comedy as a way to participate in this kind of debate culture and very wordy and argumentative place. But another important context for understanding Aristophanes in his life is if you put the extent of the Peloponnesian War here, which of course was actually a whole series of conflicts between Athens and not only Sparta but it's Sparta's client cities, and the Peloponnesian War took up a large about half of the 5th century, and so much more of a lot of the majority of Aristophanes' life, and of course at the end of the wars, Athens was a much reduced city, both politically and culturally. When we look at Lysistrata, which was produced in 411, so this is a time of upheaval in Athens itself, but it's also a time of really one of the low points in the Peloponnesian War. This is right after the disastrous expedition to Sicily, when Athens, which had the upper hand in the war to the point where the Spartans had sued for peace, already Athens rejected it, believing that they could win an outright victory and dominate the Spartans. So committed were they to this that they they took a huge gamble and spent most of while the Spartans were on the mainland of the Greek peninsula, the Athenians took the mass of their fighting force and took an expedition to Sicily, which rather than giving them a launch pad to the Peloponnese and controlling the Greek world's breadbasket, just destroyed the Athenians' war-making capability. So after that, the war was still going on, but it was clear that Athens would not be the winner like they once thought. And so Lysistrata, there's really captures this moment of war weariness and futility that Athenians must have been feeling at the time. So just a few more notes about Aristophanes' life. He intersected and he affected the lives of some of the most important Athenian figures at the time. He mocked the ordered politician Cleon in one of his early plays, The Now Lost Babylonians. And then Cleon, who was a really bloodthirsty demagogue, he was the one who who gave the speech advocating for all the adult males of Mytilene to be executed when Athens took that island. So Aristophanes made him a particular target of his, vituperation. And Cleon actually sued Aristophanes for hubris after this, which only made Aristophanes take further revenge by writing an entire play mocking Cleon, The Knight, as well as references in other plays, including Lysistrata. Aristophanes, of course, I've already mentioned his depiction of Socrates in the clouds, though it's interesting that Plato, when he wrote the Apology, his version of Socrates' defense speech brings up this caricature and even blames it partially for turning Athenian opinion against Socrates. He says, Socrates is a criminal and a busybody, investigating the things beneath the earth and in the heavens, and making the weaker argument the stronger, and teaching others these same things, exactly as he does in the Clouds. He says, you yourselves saw these things in Aristophanes' comedy, as Socrates being carried about there proclaiming that he was treading on air and uttering a vast deal of other nonsense, about which I know nothing, either much or little. So, whether it made a difference or not. Aristophanes did have did have some effect. And of course, Euripides was one of his favorite targets. He's mocked first in the play The Thesmophoriadesai, and then again right after he died, the same year that he died, in The Frogs, where of course it's all about Dionysus going into the underworld to resurrect Euripides, and then choosing Aeschylus instead. So those are my notes on Aristophanes' life and some context for the Lysistrata. Further than that, I just want to note that he's been one of while some of his plays, so much of his plays are obscure to us now due to their such local character and contemporary concerns. The plays, they're still so funny. A lot of the jokes just still land, and especially the Frogs, the one about the underworld. Stephen Sondheim turned that into a musical that premiered on Broadway in 2004, I think. And Spike Lee adapted the Lysistrata just a few years ago in modern day Chicago in 2015. And also just end with I just happened to find a new book that has just been published like last month about ancient comedy called Rude Talk in Athens. That's pretty good. It's a good introduction to the spirit and the world of ancient comedy through not Aristophanes, but one of his competing playwrights that he makes fun of, Aristophanes. And so, well, that's what I've got. I once again, thanks for taking the time to listen to me talk, and I hope to speak to everyone again as soon as we can. Bye.